I want to make clear that not all the opinions in this book are my own. I merely strive to understand history better and hopefully impart that understanding on those who listen to my videos. Secondly, I want to address why I chose to make a video on this book. The reason is I had thought that its thesis was solely the domain of people on the internet, and that no serious person believes that the war in Ukraine was in some way the result of American foreign policy. When I saw a book published by Harvard blaming American policy for Russia's heinous invasion of Ukraine, I simply had to read it. Imagine if there was a book published by Johns Hopkins University that claimed the COVID vaccine had a microchip in it and Bill Gates was using it to track the movements of people all over the world. No one could resist a text like that. I think that Haslam's book is good on the whole, and I have a lot of respect for it, but it needs to be acknowledged that this book is not the final say on the matter. In the future, more works will be made that will more deeply explore the nature of Putin's Russia, and these historians will have a more insightful view of this period than anyone today. It is to my understanding that knowledge of a topic grows as time goes on, and one day there will be a far better book than Hubris. That being said, Hubris is a good place to start, so let's get into it. The preface lays out the thesis of the book, that the war in Ukraine is partially the fault of American foreign policy and its hubris, hence the title of the book. Haslam does not let Russia escape blame, however. The preface concludes by saying that after the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine wanted to be neutral between the US and Russia, but neither nation was interested in respecting this neutrality. Chapter 1 starts with the invasion of Ukraine, simply pointing out that Russia invaded Ukraine to replace Zelensky, and while the Americans and Russians predicted a swift Russian victory, reality panned out differently. The chapter then turns to the topic of U.S.-Russia relations. There is an interesting testimony by former Polish Foreign Minister Sikorski. Sikorski explains that Putin was not always hostile to the West, and he was genuinely interested in working deeply with the EU. Putin abandoned these plans due to protests in Moscow and St. Petersburg, which convinced him that the West was trying to overthrow him like Gaddafi. Putin then resolved to create a new economic union, which would apparently be useless without Ukraine. For his part, Haslam asks why Putin invaded Ukraine when he did. Quote, "If it were a matter of personal ambition, why the delay?" Pointing out that Putin first became president in 2000. Supporting this argument is Robert Gates, former CIA director and Secretary of Defense, saying that American arrogance after the fall of the USSR led to Russian resentment. For his part, Haslam compares U.S. treatment of Russia disfavorably to how Lord Castlereagh treated France in 1815, how the Allies treated Germany after World War II, and how Keynes wanted to treat Germany after World War I. The main slight against Russia, according to Haslam, was NATO expansion. He also views NATO expansion as a blunder, best summed up in his line from Chapter 1, quote, "The U.S. government was made keenly aware at every stage of the negative impact on Russia of NATO expansion to the east. Indeed, it acted consistently against the best specialist advice within and outside the government, most notably in the teeth of strong opposition from the hitherto mighty Pentagon." End quote. My eyebrows shot into the stratosphere when I learned that the U.S. government was expanding its military alliance, apparently against the advice of the world's foremost military organization. Haslam claims that grievances inflicted on Russian prestige are why Putin faced little opposition from within his government when he invaded Ukraine. Though many were shocked, few stepped out of line. Many in the West after the invasion of Ukraine claimed that they had done, quote, "everything possible to integrate Russia into the international system," end quote, to use the words of former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. It seemed that only Roland Dumas, a foreign minister of France, stood in opposition to this idea, claiming that, quote, "the West had promised that NATO would not extend to Russia's doorstep," end quote. But even back in 1997, George Kennan was able to predict that, quote, "such a decision," expanding NATO, "may be expected to inflame the nationalistic, anti-Western, and militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion." to have an adverse effect on the development of Russian democracy, to restore the atmosphere of the Cold War to East-West relations, and to impel Russian foreign policy in directions decidedly not to our liking. Haslam does cite a Russian source that contained a, quote, laundry list of assurances NATO wouldn't expand, but more common than promises that NATO wouldn't expand were warnings like Keenan's and Lieutenant General Scowcroft, who said German entry into NATO would be the Soviet Union's worst nightmare, and another French president claimed that further expansion would alienate Russia and not be right for Europe. Gorbachev was worried that even the continued existence of NATO after the close of the Cold War could empower his opponents at home. German Foreign Minister Genscher concluded that former Soviet states could be drawn into an economic union with Europe, but NATO was different, and that bringing them into NATO would be in no one's interest. However, the United States was looking for a reason to keep NATO alive and maintain their power in Europe. Therefore, expanding NATO became the mission that would keep the alliance alive. This was helped along by Russia not engaging with its neighbors as equals, to use Haslam's words. Bush Sr. was avowedly against isolationism. His successor Clinton, however, had won election by focusing at home rather than abroad. Clinton, therefore, did not focus on drawing Russia into the rest of the Western world. In Vancouver, Clinton pledged $1.6 billion to Russia, but pressured them into sanctioning Yugoslavia, which was much more costly to their economy. Yeltsin refused to meet certain IMF demands, which prevented Russia from obtaining the capital it needed to revamp its economy. The U.S. was also of little help. George Stephanopoulos was a Clinton aide who advised against helping Russia on the grounds that it would be imprudent politically and fiscally harmful. Two last issues that would hurt U.S.-Russia relations going forward were that the U.S. prevented Russia from obtaining most favored nation status by maintaining the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, and the U.S. blocking Russia from selling arms, either because it clashed with American interests or because America didn't want any competition in the arms trade. All of this was done to Russia at a time when it had assumed the entirety of the Soviet Union's debt in order to have the dead nation's seat at the UN. Russia was in turmoil after the fall of the USSR, and the US capitalized on it rather than show any beneficence or even foresight. Chapter 2 starts with US Senator Richard Lugar reaching the conclusion that the only way for the US to stay in Europe is to expand NATO. It continues by taking a detour into Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was falling apart in the 90s and breaking into separate countries. The Serbs were committing ethnic cleansing, and recognizing Croatian independence was becoming a divisive issue in the West. As negotiations and war carried on, the Germans suddenly recognized Croatia as its own nation. Many European countries followed. This widened the conflict and created greater diplomatic fallout. The U.S. was at a loss of what to do under Clinton, but early on they decided that if they were to get involved, it would be as part of NATO. Russia felt uneasy around this time, with one of their top commanders noting that Yugoslavia was a, quote, blank patch in Europe that sat outside of the American sphere of influence. The United States would break its sclerotic demeanor in 1995 and 1999. Yugoslavia falls to the wayside as Haslam returns to NATO expansion, and a pattern ensues. Western European countries complain about expansion but do nothing. Russia warns, but the U.S. offers membership to Eastern European countries anyway. They gladly accept due to their suspicion of Russia and their detestation of the former Soviet Union. There was, however, the Partnership for Peace initiative, which Yeltsin mistook as a substitute for NATO expansion. To me, the Russians seemed very interested in a rapprochement with the United States, but not if it meant NATO would expand, especially since the United States wanted to exclude Russia from NATO membership a priori, to use the words of National Security Advisor Tony Lake. Russian suspicion of the West grew. They had figured that since the USSR had collapsed, the relationship with the United States would be less hostile, but it seemed that the US was interested in growing its power in Europe and viewing Russia as an adversary, despite the fall of the socialist superpower. Madeleine Albright gave the view of Eastern European countries, which concerned three main points. 1. They were worried that the U.S. would sacrifice them in an attempt to preserve relations with Russia. 2. They want in NATO and to exclude Russia. 3. Finally, they were, quote, concerned about how Ukraine fits into the picture and understood the danger of leaving it out, end quote. This final message left a strong impact in the U.S., according to Haslam. The Chancellor of Germany, Kohl, was displeased with how fast Clinton was expanding NATO, but this was part of a pattern I laid out where Western Europeans complained but did nothing. This expansion doomed the Partnership for Peace, and it soon became a pageant more than anything. There were American officials, including in the military, who protested against expansion, but they were sidelined as well as the Western Europeans. Clinton was vigorous in his NATO expansion, according to Secretary of State Warren Christopher. The expansion was not only the result of an American desire to stay in Europe, but also, according to Janone Walker, the goal was to distract people from the fact that America was doing nothing about Serbia and their war against Bosnia. Haslam adds that whatever the case may be, quote, there was no threat assessment that demanded NATO enlargement, end quote. Haslam claims that the Pentagon was ignored because Clinton had a strenuous relationship with the military because he was a draft dodger that allowed homosexuals to serve in the armed forces. I personally think that Clinton would have ignored them even if he banned gays from serving and if he served 100 tours in Vietnam. Yeltsin raged at Vice President Al Gore about NATO expansion. Gore claimed that Russia would not be inherently left out of NATO and that the United States would pursue greater partnership with Russia while NATO expanded. It doesn't seem Gore was lying here. He was simply caught off guard and didn't know what else to say. In the US, the idea of NATO membership for the Baltic states and Ukraine was alive and well, with a National Security Council document claiming that they should not be in a, quote, gray zone or a Russian sphere of influence, end quote. Russia, for its part, tried to draw Ukraine closer and patch relations between Moscow and Kiev. Russia's negotiations, however, were fraught. It would not be easy to form a close relationship between the two countries. Chapter 2 concludes, summing up the dynamic I mentioned. Western Europeans fear NATO expansion. Quote, the French have always been cool on it. The Germans, or at least some Germans, have switched from being advocates to skeptics. Brits have consistently tried to play both sides. End quote. American and Russian complaints against expansion, like Secretary Perry and General Shalikashvili, are ignored and Clinton continues his business. Arnold Horlick warns Congress against expanding NATO and argues for a Marshall Plan for Russia. He also reinforces the claim that NATO had been expanding to keep the alliance alive and to keep the U.S. on the continent. Before going to the next chapter, Haslam raises a very good point. Clinton tells the president of Ukraine that, quote, the U.S. does not want to see Ukraine caught between NATO and Russia, end quote. But what other outcome could prevail? Clinton expanded NATO and took away Ukraine's means of self-defense against Russia by pressuring them to give up their nuclear weapons. In my opinion, it is possible that Clinton was lying to President Kuchma. Bill is no stranger to telling fibs, after all. But it's equally possible that he was pursuing America's short-term interest and failed to seriously consider the world his policies would create in 30 years' time. It's important to remember that we have the benefit of hindsight when analyzing historical figures, and they don't. Chapter 3 begins with another question by Haslam. NATO promised that it was changing, and that it was no longer a tough military alliance. But if this were true, why did so many countries want in? In any case, the Russians were unimpressed and did not believe the promise that NATO had changed even one bit. Chapter 3 also returns to Yugoslavia and covers the Srebrenica massacre, where 8,000 Bosnian men as young as 14 were killed by Bosnian Serbs. NATO would step in and bomb the Bosnian Serbs. It also mentions that the U.S. was arming the Mujahideen, who were fighting the Serbs at the time. Anyway, the Russians raged at NATO, launching an attack against others rather than being purely defensive. The Russian ambassador to Britain claimed, quote, It means they bombed the Serbs for the purpose of preserving and strengthening NATO. After this, the book returns to the familiar pattern of NATO expansion. French President Jacques Chirac warned that if the US persisted, Russian nationalism could resurge, Yeltsin could fall, and the continental Europeans would pay the price for this, not Americans. German Chancellor Kohl rang similar alarm bells, warning that the Russian people were growing to hate Yeltsin. The UK Prime Minister noted that Yeltsin's stance toward NATO had hardened. Yeltsin had said that modest NATO expansion could have a, quote, tolerable political cost. But now he was worried and wanted to know where the alliance would stop. The Russians had hoped for some compensation for the alliance growing. They wanted to limit the amount of conventional weapons in Europe, as well as the number of missile sites. Neither of these things came to pass, and Russia was left out in the cold. This chapter ends by covering Russia's economic woes in the 1990s. I intend to release a video similar to this topic one day, but the short version is that there was a financial crisis on August 17, 1998, and this was on top of the fact that the early 90s had also been a bad time for the Russian economy. This collapse discredited Yeltsin and his reforms. A tragic quote comes from Viktor Chernomyrdin, quote, "We hoped for the best, but things turned out as they usually do," end quote. This crisis was certainly not helpful in preventing a Weimar Russia. Chapter 4 continues to cover the NATO intervention in the Balkans. The Serbs gave the US another excuse to intervene when they attacked Rasak in southern Kosovo. Russia was annoyed by the US intervening. Robert Hunter, a former American ambassador to NATO, explains, quote, "NATO has often not been inclined to consult Moscow, even when Russia has believed its interests were involved." He goes on to state Russia's nuanced position, quote, "Following Russia's acquiescence to the first NATO expansion and its possible role in the implementation force of Bosnia, the issue came to a head with the US-led NATO decision in 1998 to use air power against Serbia over Kosovo. To Russia, Serbia's humanitarian transgressions were not as important as the West's ignoring Russian concerns about the attacks on Serbia. The provocations of the ethnic Albanian Kosovo Liberation Army, and the absence of a UN security resolution. From Russia's perspective, stopping aggression against Bosnia-Herzegovina had been one thing. Attacking Serbia over Kosovo, which was part of Serbia, was quite another," end quote. A piece from The Economist claimed that the war in Kosovo was launched not as a humanitarian war. That was an excuse. The war was primarily fought to, quote, "preserve NATO's credibility," end quote. Then there's Yeltsin. He continued to complain that NATO expansion and the Yugoslavian war was making him unpopular in Russia, and that he was facing pressure to stand up to the West. So, it should come as no surprise that this chapter ends with Yeltsin resigning and Putin's rise to power. But before we leave chapter 4, there were two amusing anecdotes and a final quote that I found insightful. One was the actions of Wesley Clark. The book paints Clark poorly, saying that he ordered an airport to be seized and that he was, quote, "itching for battle." It later notes that he was overruled and punished with early retirement. This is notable as Clark is a prominent voice on the Ukrainian war today, and you can find him laying out a pro-Ukraine take. I was delighted to see him in this book. 2 is a conversation between the Prime Minister of Canada and the Foreign Minister of Belgium. In it, the Prime Minister claims that American foreign policy decisions are not made to protect the nation, but for nearsighted political interests, saying that adding the Baltic states to NATO is being done because, quote, "in Chicago, Mayor Daley controls a lot of votes." He adds, "In your country or my country, all the politicians would be in prison for selling their votes," end quote. The insightful quote comes from Lieutenant General Mike Jackson, quote, "But I think in some quarters there was still a sense that the Cold War was inbound, that the Russians weren't the Russians of 1999, but the Soviets of 1979. This underpinned the approach taken," end quote. I am sympathetic to this idea of explaining America's actions in the 90s. It seemed to me that there was a chance under Yeltsin to mend the relationship between Russia and the United States, but this never happened because, to borrow a phrase, The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. Chapter 5 is very Putin-focused. It continues talking about his rise, and Haslam claims that Putin desired a union state, using Putin's words. This union state would be pointless without Ukraine, according to Haslam, and according to former National Security Advisor Brzezinski. Britain tried getting cozy with the Russians under Blair. The Russian arms industry and Britain's energy sector sought to gain here. Blair also sided with the Russians in the war in Chechnya. Blair saw it as an issue of Islamic extremism, according to his memoir. At this time, Russia was still trying to accommodate NATO to no avail. Putin says, quote, "We believe we can talk about more profound integration with NATO, but only if Russia is regarded as an equal partner. You are aware we have been constantly voicing our opposition to NATO's eastward expansion." Haslam also gets into the Bush Jr. administration. He seemed to believe Bush Jr. was a lightweight in foreign policy. This meant that most foreign policy planning would fall to Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. They seemingly guide the rest of the administration around, especially Cheney. According to Robert Hunter, who spoke on the admin, quote, "The prevailing view in the George W. Bush administration was that since the Soviet Union had lost the Cold War, the U.S. and NATO would do as they please," end quote. A Russia analyst named Jim Goldgeier claims that, quote, "The Bush administration was less concerned about Russia's reaction than the Clinton team had been in 1996, end quote, referring to NATO expansion. The admin was interested in a national missile defense, or NMD, which Russia felt was aimed at them, and reasonably so, according to Tony Blair. The Bush comment about looking into Putin's eyes is in here. But what's more important is actually a comment made by Russian Defense Minister Sergei Ivanov while meeting with Strobe Talbot. Ivanov expressed a willingness to help the U.S. with bin Laden, but first he wanted to know whether America thought Chechen combatants were bandits or freedom fighters. Haslam notes that nothing would have made Putin happier than to have the U.S. focus on counterterrorism. Condoleezza Rice, however, advocated against any sort of rapprochement on this issue. However, Putin stepped out of line with those around him, including Ivanov, and cooperated with the United States. Ivanov did not want NATO poking around in Central Asia, but Putin insisted on working with the U.S., thinking that 9/11 would create a realignment. Putin's cooperation in Afghanistan did help Russia obtain a seat on the G7. While Putin continued to work with the U.S. on terrorism, he also urged NATO to slow its roll, and he objected to the Baltic states joining the alliance. Ultimately, however, there was no realignment, as Putin himself later admitted, quote, "They agreed with us, but after a little time had passed, everything went back to normal," end quote. There was also an opportunity for NATO to work alongside Russia in a way and treat it more amicably through a sort of council, but Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz successfully shot this down. This was a major turning point for Putin. Despite Putin's support for the U.S. in Afghanistan, he chided the United States for invading Iraq. He saw that war as a blunder and potentially a threat to the world's security. He was in agreement with much of Western Europe on this, but at the end of the day, he couldn't create a divide in NATO over the Iraq War. Putin had granted the United States leeway in fighting in Afghanistan, but the U.S. was not willing to grant him the same in dealing with the rebels in Chechnya. All the while, Ivanov complains, quote, "The alliance is gaining greater ability to control and monitor Russian territory. We cannot turn a blind eye as NATO's air and military bases get much closer to cities and defense complexes in European Russia," end quote. Putin's acquiescence to the U.S. spawned a foreboding quote in the New York Times, quote, "Mr. Putin has often balked at American foreign policy thrusts. From the White House's abandonment of the Cold War-era anti-ballistic missile treaty to its support for expanding NATO into the former Soviet Union, to a 2002 nuclear arms reduction treaty that many Russian experts criticize as weighted in favor of the United States. In the end, analysts and others say he has shrugged and accepted each because his judgment is that close ties to the United States are a top priority if Russia is to rebuild its global role, end quote. There is one last note I want to touch on before getting back to Russian-American relations. Apparently, the war in Iraq was conceived before 9/11, and the greatest terrorist attack in American history was seen by some as an impediment to the invasion of Iraq. This doesn't have much to do with our topic, but it was impossible to not point out. Chapter 6 lays out that while Russia agreed with Bush Jr.'s war on terror, they were uncomfortable with the idea of regime change, especially since regime change had led to Islamic fundamentalism in Afghanistan and Iran. I personally found this to be a very interesting nuance to American-Russian relations. Haslam also spends a little time in Georgia, the country, not the state, to talk about how Russia mediated between Georgian protesters and the Georgian government to bring a new man named Saakashvili to power. Russia engaged in this not so much to protect her interests, but as a matter of prestige. Ukraine was a different matter. There, Russia and the U.S. were supporting two different factions in the country. Sandy Vershbow, U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, said that this is, quote, when I think Putin began to feel that all the West's talk of partnership was a smokescreen for a cynical plot to undermine Russia, to deprive it of its rightful domination over its neighbors, and even to bring about color revolutions all over the former Soviet space, including in Russia itself, and ultimately topple the Putin regime, end quote. The West was also growing wary of Putin as he extended his control across his country. In 2005, the U.S. Senate held a hearing called Democracy in Retreat in Russia. To these charges, Putin would later respond by saying, well, we really would not want the kind of democracy they have in Iraq. Bush replied to Putin's face and said, just wait, it's coming. Haslam notes a troubling dynamic that he calls probably the worst combination that NATO simultaneously presented. That combo was American assertiveness and Western European timidity. During the Bush administration, Putin expressed his worry about NGOs or non-governmental organizations. To him, these were undemocratic institutions that showed that the West was not interested in democracy, but rather it wanted to push its power over other nations and was willing to use these underhanded methods to do it. According to former National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley, the U.S. and Russia were working on rules for how the countries could maneuver in Europe, but that, quote, that progress all fell apart really under the pressure of the color revolutions, the revolutions in Georgia and Tajikistan and Ukraine and elsewhere, end quote. Ambassador Burns laid out the three big snags for U.S.-Russia relations: Kosovo, NATO membership for Georgia and Ukraine, and finally, the national missile defense. Burns says, quote, Ukrainian entry into NATO is the biggest of all red lines for the Russian elite, end quote. Though Kosovo was a big snag as well, in 2008 Kosovo declared independence, and the US, UK, and France breached UN Security Council Resolution 1244 and recognized the new state. After this, there is another line from Putin on how he worries about NATO expansion and sees it as a threat. This time, however, he says something very damning. Quote, doesn't your government know that NATO is a very divisive issue there? Don't you know that Ukraine is not even a real country? Part of it is really East European, and part is really Russian, end quote. German ambassador Ralph Nickel notes that giving Ukraine membership would be more difficult than most, since a lot of Russians see Ukraine as, quote, inexorably intertwined with Russia, end quote, and that this association dates back to 988 apparently. As Putin's presidency was ending, he openly questioned Ukraine's existence, its territorial integrity, its history, and he also mused on how the Budapest Memorandum, which guaranteed Ukraine's safety, was never approved by the Duma. Out of all the quotes in this book, none were more revolting to me than Putin's statements here. The only competition were the quotes on Iraq from the last chapter. The Georgia War is covered only briefly, and in my opinion, Haslam seems to blame the Georgian leader for, quote, prematurely counting on American support, and guided by President Saakashvili, the Georgian army finally began bombarding the breakaway republic of South Ossetia, which had increasingly come under Russian protection, end quote. Kurt Volker lays out an interesting dynamic within NATO. Some allies saw Russia's war with Georgia as a response to Western provocation. Others felt NATO had left Georgia out to dry and that Russia pounced on this opportunity. I am uncertain which of these two ideas is true or more accurate, but we do perhaps get a look into Putin's thinking according to Verschbau. Quote, Putin maintained that Russia wanted to be like China, to sit under the roots of the tree and build its power quietly, but that immediate global responsibilities forced it to act, end quote. In 2009, NATO reasserted the plan to eventually have Georgia and Ukraine in NATO. On an unspecified date, Bush Jr. said of Putin, quote, we lost him. You know, I don't know how, but we lost him, end quote. Haslam notes how oblivious this makes Bush sound. In Chapter 7, we ditch that dummy for Barack Obama, though we also get a damning appraisal from his Secretary of Defense, Ashton Carter, who said that Obama, quote, seemed to be focused more on avoiding the kind of mistakes made by some of his predecessors, such as the disastrous war in Iraq, than on enunciating an overarching vision of his own, end quote. According to Verschbau, however, quote, Obama repeated one mistake that was made during the Bush administration. Particularly, I mention Rumsfeld, and maybe Cheney bears the blame for this, which was in diminishing the importance of Russia. The argument that Russia didn't matter anymore, that we could basically solve most of our problems without Russia. If they wanted to help us, fine, we don't have to reward them for that. If they are acting in their own interests, such as helping us topple the Taliban in Afghanistan, then why pay them any compensation, end quote. Despite a conciliatory and apologetic speech at the UN by Barack Obama, Putin continued to worry about NGOs. This fear was not assuaged by the Arab Spring. Putin would go on to say of the U.S. bombing Libya, quote, this is becoming a persistent tendency in U.S. policy. During the Clinton era, they bombed Belgrade. Bush sent forces to Afghanistan. Then, under an invented false pretext, they sent forces into Iraq, liquidated the entire Iraqi leadership. Even children in Saddam Hussein's family died, end quote. Libya was a disaster for Russia-U.S. relations. Russia had allowed a no-fly zone in Libya on the grounds that this would prevent further civilian deaths, but NATO began expanding the mission to overthrow the leader of Libya, Gaddafi. The president of Russia at the time, Medvedev, bunted heads with Putin. Putin was vehement in his objections to the Libya situation. He would later claim that this is when Russia and the United States truly fell out with one another. Next year, Putin would sign a law against NGOs. In my opinion, he viewed these as the vector by which he would be overthrown by the US, and he sought to avoid the fates of Saddam and Gaddafi. Putin was definitely moving away from the West, as a whole, not just the United States. Chapter 7 ends with Syria. Syria would be seen by Putin as another example of American meddling causing chaos. The Assad government of Syria was backed by Iran, Hezbollah, and soon Russia. The United States started backing the rebels against Assad. Syria, like Kosovo, Libya, and Iraq, could be their own separate videos. What's important in this video is that Putin did see this as a part of America toppling governments in the Middle East. Putin openly compared Syria to Libya, and according to Haslam, Putin feared Islamic radicals spreading into Russia's backyard, like Central Asia and the Caucasus. Chapter 8 is going to be the most controversial chapter in this book by far. It is simply called Maidan. It starts out with a quote from a Russian intelligence official who notes that Russia sometimes fails to influence nations because they only focus on the elite, whereas, quote, The West work with the entire population, end quote. This is what he attributes to Ukraine drifting away from Russia and toward the West. A good example of this was Yanukovych. Haslam notes that when he was elected in 2010, Moscow was not very happy with him, even though he did end up pushing away the EU and took a huge loan from Russia. This was crucial to the economic union Putin sought to create. The West, by contrast, put Ukraine on the back burner, and the US set the Iran deal as its highest priority. Haslam does remark that the US had not totally given up on Ukrainian membership into NATO after previous attempts had failed. He notes that the US had spent billions trying to integrate Ukraine into Europe, and that this mission was led by USAID. Then there is the Victoria Nuland call. Victoria Nuland was at the time the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. For me, it is not scandalous that Nuland expressed a preference for who would replace Yanukovych, though this certainly doesn't help the charges that the US was trying to start regime change in Ukraine. The more damning thing is that when she was told that the EU may not agree with her, she stated, quote, "Fuck the EU." Having such contempt for what Europeans want on their own continent was baffling to me. Both internationally and domestically, the situation in Ukraine was getting out of control. Internationally, Putin was gesturing to support anti-EU protesters in Cyprus and Greece if the West backed pro-EU protesters in Ukraine. And domestically, protesters were fighting police. There were Molotovs and sniper fire. Haslam does not paint a clear picture of what happened there, but I doubt this is his fault. The BBC interviewed a lawyer who was struggling to get an actual investigation into the shootings. Haslam in this chapter notes that the West aided the overthrow of Yanukovych. Nuland repeated the claim that $5 billion had been invested in Ukraine to bring Ukraine into a European future. And in an interview with Fareed Zakaria, George Soros claimed to be actively supporting dissidents in Ukraine. In my opinion, it can be dangerous to fall into the trap that the Euromaidan protesters were all just puppets played for fools and bought by the West to overthrow an unfriendly, anti-Europe government. This is not something I subscribe to. Foreign money can help a movement, but it cannot create one out of thin air. Western support likely helped the pro-Europe movement grow, but the seeds were already there in the minds and deeds of the Ukrainian people. They were not astroturfed. That analogy is as close as I will ever get to touching grass. Later, the protesters and Yanukovych came to terms. However, Yanukovych ditched Ukraine and moved to Moscow against Putin's wishes. The Ukrainian parliament violated the constitution in Article 111 when they declared he was no longer the leader of Ukraine. Haslam's citation says that the president of Ukraine can only leave office either by resignation, impeachment, ill health, or death, which kinda is ill health, but I digress. The Kremlin viewed this as a revolution to bring Ukraine into the European Union, then into NATO, then to start another revolution in Russia. Fortunately for them, there was a front where they could push their advantage. Crimea was a source of pro-Russian separatism, and this sentiment grew sometime after Yanukovych's fraudulent presidential election in 2004. This gave Russia an opportunity to annex the territory in so many words. Interestingly, Haslam seems to blame the US for not being stronger here and deterring this covert Russian aggression. Putin had learned this trick from the West. He openly compared his annexation of Crimea to the West's recognition of Kosovo. Quote, "There is no need for the consent of the central authorities of a country for a unilateral declaration of independence," end quote. Obama did little according to the U.S. ambassador to Georgia, and according to Obama, he felt the matter was out of his hands because Ukraine, quote, "is going to be vulnerable to military domination no matter what we do," end quote. Lastly, I want to cover three more things. 1. NATO was in chaos after the Crimean incursion. Obama complained that his European allies did not want to act seriously, or in the way that he did. 2. Russia encroached further into Ukraine by arming separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk. A Russian newspaper called Ukraine, quote, "Little Russia," which is a term from the Tsarist days. Haslam dismisses the idea that Russia was intervening to stop neo-Nazis. Though many Ukrainian nationalists praised Nazi collaborator Stefan Bandera, this is only a small grain of truth in something that is otherwise untrue. And 3, it should be noted that Vice President Joe Biden favored a much harder stance on Russia and that he was openly bragging about American influence in Ukraine. Chapter 9 is a mere 7 pages. It mostly pertains to Russia backing the Assad government against ISIS. It also notes that Assad is a particularly troublesome ally who is politically stubborn and possibly takes Russian aid for granted. The most notable part of this chapter is at the beginning, where Putin says of Americans, quote, "You declare war on terrorists and simultaneously try to use some of them to arrange the figures on the Middle East board in your own interests, as you may think," end quote. Ultimately, Russia's support of the Syrian government isn't very relevant to Ukraine, in my opinion. Chapter 10 is called Trump Fails. Haslam was harsh on Obama and his foreign policy, but it was pretty funny to see him start a chapter with calling a president a failure. The chapter also starts by briefly mentioning Project Lakhra, which was a Russian disinformation campaign designed to undermine people's faith in their democracy. This chapter does get into the Trump-Russia scandal. Key parts from Haslam's telling are that the CIA director told Obama of, quote, alleged approval by Hillary Clinton of a proposal from one of her foreign policy advisors to vilify Donald Trump by stirring up a scandal claiming interference by Russian security services, end quote. He also says that the Mueller report later found no evidence at all of collusion by Trump. Lastly, and most importantly for Haslam, Trump lost Michael Flynn as a member of his staff due to the Trump-Russia debacle. Haslam seems to believe that Trump's foreign policy would have been more coherent with Flynn, but now it was lost in confusion among those who remained in the Trump administration. The Russians had some enthusiasm for Flynn, but now that he was gone, and after seeing what the Trump administration had to offer, Putin was put off. Quote, "I have spoken to 3 U.S. presidents. They come and go, but politics stay the same at all times. Do you know why? Because of the powerful bureaucracy," end quote. More specifically, the Kremlin loathed Trump for arming Ukraine and bombing Syria. The final note worth covering about Trump 1 is his confused attitude toward NATO. The president seemed to think that NATO was pointless, but he also wanted countries to contribute more. He wanted allies to pay for American bases, and he was upset that the U.S. had trade deficits with European countries. He even openly complained about this on Twitter. All of this put the military alliance under strain. Chapter 11 is the final chapter, and it details how weak Europe, but especially Germany, was against Russia. Angela Merkel apparently spoke to Putin twice a week. The Germans might have been convinced that deepening economic ties with Russia would make them more peaceful, but it's also possible that buying Russian gas emboldened the Kremlin. I think that this could only work if the U.S. did not have a policy of regime change during the Obama and Bush years. German money provides a nice incentive for peace, but ultimately, if the U.S. is seen as a threat to Russia, no amount of money will mend ties between Russia and the West. In fact, by not cutting Russia out entirely after Crimea, Germany might have made things worse. The conclusion of Hubris recounts some watershed moments between Russia and the United States we have already gone over. Libya, Clinton's NATO expansion, the fall of Yanukovych, etc. It covers the war in Ukraine only briefly and mentions how peace talks were ruined by 3 massacres of Ukrainians and by Boris Johnson, according to one of Zelensky's aides. It also mentions how the war is a disaster for Russia geopolitically. Putin's failure to secure a quick victory seems to have doomed Russia to a stalemate and a quagmire. As of my writing this, the war is still going on, with no end in sight. I have no proposed solutions to how to end the war or negotiate a peace, and seemingly Haslam doesn't either. I can only hope this video gives people a better understanding of what led to the war in Ukraine.